I'm very pleased to have Chuck Casto here today as our guest speaker, in part because I myself have been doing research on the Fukushima nuclear crisis and have learned a great deal from Dr. Casto. Chuck Casto was the chief liaison for the U.S. government during the nuclear crisis. He was here for 11 months, starting just a couple of days after the event occurred. Prior to coming to Fukushima, Chuck had worked in the nuclear industry for some 38 years. As he mentioned to me one time, starting all the way from turning wrenches at a reactor to eventually becoming a plant operator at the Browns Ferry site, which was also a Mark I design reactor like the Fukushima site. At the time of the nuclear crisis, he was the head of the construction inspections for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. After he concluded his work here, after some 11 months living in Japan, he then became a regional administrator over, I think, 8 states and some 23 reactors. You know, people have said, and I suppose it may be true, that there may be no American or English-speaking person who knows more about this crisis than Chuck Casto, because he was very much involved in this from the very beginning. As the chief liaison to the U.S. government, he worked very close with Ambassador Ruse, and he also worked very closely with plant manager Yoshida, Goshi Hosono, who was the minister for the nuclear crisis, and Prime Minister Khan himself, consulting with them. So from the very beginning of this disaster, he was involved. He was just out at Fukushima, both visiting the Daiichi and Daini plant yesterday. So he will talk today both about his experience, but also about, more broadly, crisis management. At the conclusion of his experience here in Japan, he somehow found time to get a doctorate degree and an MBA, and the subject was crisis management and extreme events, which he had lived through here at Fukushima. So it's my pleasure, and I think our privilege to have Chuck Casto.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's not a funeral. Good evening. There you go. Okay, first things, and I know you're shocked. Okay, I know that you're sitting there saying to yourself, there is no way this fellow has 38 years of experience in the nuclear industry. He looks way too young. You know, there's no. How many of you are students in here? Okay, so you were forced to be here. So on the wall it said, here's your problem. Find the equation in the line that passes through point 11 and is parallel to the line 2x minus 5y equals 10. Okay? At least you'll have some answers when you come out of here tonight from doing that. So I really am honored to be here tonight with you all and excited that you spend your evening here listening to me. I'm not clear why that happens, but I appreciate your being here. So I want to talk about my experiences in Japan for the Fukushima event, and then my reflections of what I learned after when I look back and say, okay, what did all this mean, sort of theoretically and academically? So I'll try to get into both areas, and I'll probably speak for 25 minutes or something like that. And then we'll get into some Q&As. And actually, if there's something really stands out as I go through this, you know, somebody really just wants to ask, feel free to do that. I'm all right with that. So we'll try to keep it somewhat informal. So what is my experience with Fukushima? Kyle said, I was in obscurity, in a job in obscurity in Atlanta, Georgia, working and over inspecting all new nuclear construction in the United States. I wasn't in operations. I'd been an operator for many years and been in operations for a long time, but had moved over to construction. I started out my career in construction, actually a construction worker at a nuclear power plant. So I was working in construction, so I wasn't really in the operations area when Fukushima Daiichi happened. So I was watching it from the television like many of you, watching it from afar, and I wasn't part of the response of the American government in that first day or so. And so I remember I was actually at a gas station getting gas when I first heard about it or something, and one of my neighbors called me knowing that I know a little bit about nuclear and said, hey, what's up with this nuclear plant in Japan? All right, and I said, well, you know, I understand they had a loss of power and they've had some problems, but everything will be okay. They'll get power back and they'll recover and everything will be just fine. That was my first time I was wrong, I think. And later when he found out that I was leading the U.S. government effort here in Japan, he was like, you, Mr. Everything's going to be okay, is the guy that's going to lead this, you know? So I don't think I had a lot of credibility with him before I came over. And then somewhere that weekend, I guess it was, the president asked to expand Operation Tomodachi to the nuclear plant and provide support for Japan on nuclear advice, and asked the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to send somebody to lead a team in Tokyo. So with about 3 hours notice, the first thing they asked me was, do you have a passport? I said, yeah, well, I have a passport. And so then you have an airplane in 3 hours, get your stuff and go to Tokyo. We're a place that I'd never been before. So I arrived early in the next week. And the first, I guess, you know, we all know how worried people were, but it really struck me when I got on the airplane to come over here. I got on an American aircraft to come over here, and I was sitting back where all good government workers sit, in the back of the airplane with the cows and the chickens and the pigs, you know, where they put all those. So I'm sitting back there, you know, fighting for armrest with a chicken. And so the flight crew came up, the purser came up, the flight crew, and she said, Mr. Casto, would you get your stuff and come with me? And we're at cruising altitude, and I thought, you know, she had known that I was from the nuclear industry because I had a nuclear shirt on. And so I thought they were going to throw me off the airplane at cruising altitude. You know, that I was like, look, I didn't cause the accident, okay? I'm actually going over to help, right? I didn't cause the accident. But and she takes me up to first class. And I'm thinking, this is sweet. I get a first class seat to Japan. This is awesome. Because I had books to read about the accident. And I wanted to spend time reading. And I wanted to sleep. So, because I assumed we wouldn't get much sleep when we got over here. But what I didn't realize was they were so afraid of flying to Japan, that flight crew, that they literally came up to me, and not an exaggeration, for over 6 hours, I answered their questions. They would come up one at a time, you know, should we be flying to Japan? Should we be monitored? And unfortunately, I had a little TLD on my shirt, you know, the government TLD, monitor, those little monitor things, whatever they're called. And she said, what's that? And I immediately responded and said, well, it measures the level of radiation. And then about halfway through that sentence, I realized I should have not said that, okay? I shouldn't say that. So she said, well, why don't we have one? And I'm trying to think real quick because, you know, I know that they're unionized, and the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to say this nuclear expert was monitored and we're not monitored, and the airlines. In fact, they came up. This story's probably taking too long, but I like the story anyhow, so I like hearing it. They came up at one point and said, you know, this airline doesn't care about our lives at all. They're flying us over here, and they don't care about our lives, flying us into this accident. And you know, when you're trying to console somebody, it's you know, probably not best to tell them they're wrong. But so I agreed with her in the fact that I said, look, you know, okay, I don't know whether they care about you as a person or not. I assume they do, but I'm not certain. But I know there is one thing they care about. And what is that? They care about that airplane. Okay? And they're not going to fly this airplane into a plume of radiation and get it contaminated, because that'll be the end of this airplane. Okay? So they may not care about you, but they care about the airplane. So I don't know if that consoled her. You you know, I don't have a doctorate in philosophy, but I'm not sure whether that consoled them or not. But I can tell you, you know, they'd go back in little clusters and they would think of more questions, and then they would come back up and all I was thinking was, man, I could use a nap, right? And I really wanted to read this stuff. So when you look at worldwide fear, right, from this accident, it was fear. We live, you know, we're seeing it with Ebola today, right? We know the book, you know, The Earth is Flat, or whatever the name of that book is. That's ever more so true. That the transboundary events are more common today than ever, and will continue to be common with worldwide communications, aircraft travel. So these transboundary events, we're all one world now. And an event in one place, a severe crisis in one place, is a severe crisis everywhere. And people want to know the information. So one of the challenges we have are, you know, look at the Malaysia flights, right? That's a challenge, getting information from those governments about you know, what happened to those flights from both governments that were involved in the Malaysia flights. From, you know, there are a lot of catastrophes and disasters out there today where we don't have control of the data. And what do? You know, how do we protect our citizens? Each of our countries have many citizens in many other countries, and we want to protect them. But we don't, in a lot of cases, we don't own the data, right? We don't own it. So how do we protect our citizens in these countries without us owning the data? So I think that's one open question. I have some ideas about that. You know, we need international agreements on data sharing, protocols, terminology. Even in the nuclear industry, as homogeneous as the nuclear industry is, we had many different terms between the Japanese and the Americans and the international community. Even the emergency classifications were different. So, you know, if one of the things we need is a common set of terminology. We need to have common terms, and then we need to have protocols about when and how is that data shared. What's the timing of that data? And how is it shared? And what is our common terminology? So those are just a few things we have to look at from an international community about crisis leadership. Because without that data, it's very hard to lead a crisis. We see in Fukushima, you know, I've said this many times, and I've heard it said, that Fukushima was like trying to solve a murder and not having access to the crime scene. All right. So how do you know? So you're having secondary and tertiary sources of information. Much of that information is just flat wrong. Right. It's flat wrong. So you're trying to weed out, you know, what is good information from what is bad information. And by the way, I am way off track on my talk. So I have an outline here that I was going to go through, but I think I probably have to abandon that already. So it was very organized. So if you want to look at it later, it'd be great, because it's really organized. It's an outline and everything, but I've blown that. So I forgot where I was at. But so we have to look at these protocols, and Fukushima, without data, how do you manage a crisis when you can't get information? That's the challenge. And I had a lot of lessons learned on that myself, on how to lead when you don't have information, how to manage a crisis. And even worse, I think, particularly in the Fukushima case, you have this random data set that comes in, you know, from all over the place. Random data. You don't know what's valid, what isn't valid. And what I found people were doing was they were running to the leaders with every piece of data that came in, right? So that led to leadership panic, because I actually created. Okay, hey, this is I could actually do this. All right, this is like I'm not a university professor or anything like that, but am I not talking good enough?
No, Dr. Casto, when you said that the information was being vetted by the leaders, are you talking about the government response, or are you talking about the industry response?
Call it whatever you want. Nobody had any information, but here's so this is, I kind of call this the Casto pandemonium curve. Okay? So as data declines, what happens to pandemonium? It goes up, right? It goes way up. So the less data that you have, the more pandemonium you're going to have. Right? So you gotta understand that pandemonium is going to happen. And I'm going to erase this, or otherwise that camera's going to have that behind my head. Everybody got this? It's going to be on the exam, so write it down. All right? Put it down on paper. Don't say I didn't tell you. So how do you lead? How do you lead when you don't have any data like we did in Fukushima? And people would come in, people would post silly videos on YouTube about what's happening. I mean, some crazy videos. I don't know if that's a technical term, crazy videos, but you know, there were people who would just put flat out wrong stuff. Take 1% truth and turn it into 100%, you know, crazy scenario and put it on the web. And all it did was to lead to societal panic. You know, it contributed to societal panic by that stuff. And so there was a lot of irresponsibility. And I'll just say it, you know, there was a lot of irresponsibility of people publishing things that they had no idea whether it was true or not. They just carried it on or expanded on it because they thought they were experts. And you know, it was the first web stream nuclear accident. Right? So you got data is coming to the public faster than the government can get it out, because governments try to be responsible, right? They try to be responsible, so the speed of information coming from them is going to be much slower than it is from reporters going out and finding sources and web streaming stuff and doing all that stuff. So you've got you've got two different timelines, two different speeds of data flow. And that causes a lot of confusion in the public. And that's another reason I think there has to be an international protocol about data, where countries should be required to give certain data at certain times, and so that you know what's coming out officially. And you can officially, you know, you can respond to that and protect your people. So that's part of that protocol. But you learn, and then these random data points would come in, and people would carry that information to the super leaders, the superordinate leaders, and so one minute they would say, this is catastrophic, here's a piece of data that shows that, you know, we're going to have to evacuate Tokyo or something, right? And then the next 10 minutes later, somebody else would come in with a piece of data that says, well, things are getting better. And when you look at politicians that are in charge, and they don't know the technology, they get very confused, right? They get very confused about what is this event about. They're not a nuclear person, and so then they start, you know, then that feeds into leadership panic, right? So, yes, sir.
You just alluded to the potential that this was a catastrophic event, the severity, possibility of evacuating Tokyo. Prime Minister at the time commented said something.
You just alluded to how the potential exists that this was a catastrophic event of 20-some million people having to be evacuated and so on. And I follow what you said. I'm wondering, since you were there on the scene and at the center of it, and I'm not sure if this is in the outline that you're not using yet, right, whether we might benefit from you going through the outline of what your experience was.
Yeah, seriously, I am going to get to the outline here in a minute. Okay. As soon as I get done telling a few stories. But hey, Kyle, you didn't tell me there was going to be any hard questions. Where's he at? He told me there'd be questions, but he never said anything about hard questions, all right? I don't do hard questions. No hard questions. So, I don't know, I lost track of where I was at, so maybe I ought to jump to the outline. Where was it? Oh, leadership panic. Yeah, leadership panic. So one of the things I've learned in my research is that, and this, carry this back, you know, write this down. This is important. You writing? And so if you're a politician, if you're an elected official, and you have this unknown, and you have to find a technical interpreter. You know, you have to find somebody that you can trust that can interpret what's going on for you, and that's reliable, and you know that you can trust them. And one of the problems that happened at Fukushima, and this kind of segues into my, watch how I do this, this will be real smooth. One of the problems that happened at Fukushima was that, I think when you look at Khan, and I'll be honest with you about the Prime Minister, because there were certain things I disagree with that he did. On the other hand, there are things that I understand and I'm sympathetic about. And one of the things that I'm sympathetic about is the information flow. And the theme of my talk here has been the information flow. And I'm quickly running out of time, but I'm going to take more time. The information flow, when Khan looked at the institutions, right, his institutions really didn't give him what he needed. Right? That's a polite way of saying that it was institutional failure. What I would call an organizational failure or a systems failure. Okay, the system failed. Okay, and so here he is. He looks to academia, he looks to the utility, he looks to the regulator, he looks at all these different institutions. This is just, look, I don't know. I'm not telling you anything. I haven't even talked to Khan, Prime Minister Khan, but if I were in his seat, here's the way I would look at this situation. There's a lot of people who are not giving me what I need. Okay. The other issue is two things in the United States are different. One, the White House finds a technical interpreter that they can trust. Okay. They look, and it's not necessarily a scientist. It's an interpreter, a technical interpreter, someone who can convey an accident or convey a situation in terms that the uninformed politician can understand. So they look for that. The other thing is, and particularly in the nuclear industry, the national government has an employee who works at that facility and lives there, that the president can call up, that somebody who the president owns, somebody that works for the president, he or she, we ever had a female president, can call directly to that site and say, what's going on? And the expectation is that inspector will be in the control room understanding what's going on. And so you can flatten the organization to nothing, to two people, the top and the person on the ground. So if you look at Khan, for instance, and he's looking around at his institutions, and his institutions are not where he wants them to be in terms of giving him advice, then what's he do? All right? Any good commanding general would do what? Go to the battlefield, right? Daiichi was a battlefield. Clearly it was a battlefield. And as a commanding general, you would go there and get the information for yourself, particularly if you don't have somebody on the ground who... So if you look at that from a systems point of view, so I'm trying to stay on my... So from a systems breakdown, there were a number of organizational flaws in the structure of the response in the Japanese government that manifested themselves during the accident itself. And then I'll just segue. I have to cut out a lot because I'm really running out of time, and that's tragic. But here's the point I want to make. Points I want to make to you. There were 5 crises. Everybody talks about 3. And they always talk about the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear crisis. Right? 3 crises in this event. There were 5 in my mind. Okay, there was the earthquake, the tsunami, the nuclear event, societal crisis, a crisis of society, and a policy crisis, an organizational crisis, particularly a policy crisis. Right? And unless you address all of those, because I got to get to the point about what it will take to make a decision on restart of the nuclear fleet. We're not even at the place where we can ask that question in my mind. Because before you ask the question, is ready to restart, is it time for restart, you have to address all those crises. Of course, the tsunami and the earthquake is being addressed by the NRA. The regulator is coming up with new guidelines on that. on those two issues. In addition, you have to fix Fukushima Daiichi. Right? If you can't prove to the public that you can repair, that you can recover from one of these accidents, they're not going to let you do it again. Right? So you've got to repair, you've got to recover from the original accident. You've got to do that. And then you have to look at the lessons learned for the tsunami and earthquake and technically address those issues. Now let's move to societal issues. What are the societal issues you have to address? Well, you have to prove to the people you'll protect them. Right? So you've got to do emergency planning issues. You've got to make sure that your emergency planning structure and your protection of the people is solid, that it will protect the people and they have confidence that you'll protect them. And all that involves realistic scenarios, realistic planning, realistic evacuation, notification, all of that. Prompt notification, realistic evacuation. So you have to do that. And then from a policy point of view, the key is there has to be a national conversation on the acceptable level of risk. Because in the end, for any nation, for any people, the people determine how much risk they're willing to accept. Not the politicians often think they're the ones, right? They like to think that they're the ones in charge. But I can tell you that the people are in charge. They will demand from the politicians if they believe that some of man's activities are too risky, they're going to stand up, right? They're going to speak out. So to address the policy crisis, you have to listen to the people, and you have to understand, either educate them on the level of risk, or listen to them, or both, on the level of risk, to devise an acceptable threshold of risk, to draw a line in your policy by law and say, this is the acceptable level of risk that we're willing to take. Below that line, you can operate, you can do many things below that line, but you can't go above that line of risk, acceptable level of risk. In the United States, in the Atomic Energy Act, it's called reasonable assurance of adequate protection of people and the environment. Reasonable assurance. The legal term is reasonable assurance. And what's happened over the decades since the Atomic Energy Act is courts and the policy people and the regulator have refined what reasonable assurance means. There's actually a process to go through, a backfit process it's called, and many other processes that bound what is reasonable assurance of adequate protection. Right? So it's become a sort of a legal standard. And so that's a line. If your threshold is zero risk, right, well then what's the safest reactor? Safest reactor is a reactor that's not working, right? It's not operating. That's zero risk. It's not operating. Okay, well if that's what the people determine, then that's what it is. That's the threshold that you're willing to accept. But you have to have that national dialogue, and then once you decide that line, you have to tell the regulator that they have to regulate to that line, right? So right now what you have is an imbalance. There's an imbalance in the structure, in the Japanese structure right now, of responsibility. Let's talk about, quickly, Kyle, let's talk about, we okay? Am I still got you guys?
Yeah.
We all right? I'm gonna like wind up here and wrap it up.
Chuck, you can spend another 10 minutes or so.
Ooh, 10 minutes.
Because we go till 9.
Now what if I go to 11, Kyle? What are you gonna do?
And I'll say you can go till 12.
Okay, thank you. So, what was I talking about? The imbalance of power, the imbalance of responsibility. Let's go back to the 1900s in Japan. 1900s in Japan, I think there were like 150 utilities, something like that, providing electricity to the country. And after the war, there were 9. And the 9 were set up basically in competition with each other. And the ones that had nuclear in them kept that knowledge really secret. They were the elites, right? And that part is in any country. The utilities that have the nuclear, they were the elites, right? So they had the power. They controlled the power because they had the I almost said weapon. They had the technology. They knew the most about it, and they could tell the politicians whatever they needed to tell them. And generally, without a strong regulator, people just listened to them, right? So there was this imbalance of responsibility, and the utilities had all the power, had all the responsibility, right? And the government didn't have as much responsibility in it. So let's look at what happens. Well, then Japan gets nuclearized from the power plants, and some utilities are very strong and they have nuclear power and they're the elites and they have all the responsibility and all the power. And then Fukushima comes along, right? And the first thing you understand is the government doesn't know anything about the technology. Maybe that's an exaggeration. I shouldn't say they don't know anything. But clearly there was institutional breakdown, systems breakdown, because the government didn't understand the technology. All right, so you got this breakdown, and the regulator was weak. I think we all know that, right? The regulator was weak because the utility had all the power. So now what's happened is that all the power and responsibility has shifted to where? To the regulator. Okay, so the pendulum swings the other way. Hey, this is nothing new. The United States did this after 3 Mile Island. After 3 Mile Island, we swung the pendulum. We issued thousands of new requirements and regulations and everything else, and the regulator got stronger and stronger and imposed all kinds of requirements on the utilities, and we spent the next 20 years backing them down because they were overreactions. Okay, so there's nothing different here in Japan than we've gone through before. All right, at 3 Mile Island, after 3 Mile Island. There's nothing new here. So then all the power goes to the regulator, right? Well, that's not a healthy situation. For one thing, the regulator is very concerned with the technical. With those first 2 crises that I talked about of the 5, they're very concerned about the tsunami, they're very concerned about the earthquake. But what about that 4th crisis, the societal crisis? Is the regulator understanding the societal impacts and the societal policies? That's the role of the elected officials. So, I think in a healthy structure, everyone, it's shared responsibility and shared power. A balance of those things, right? Everybody has a role. The government listens to the people, establishes the laws for the regulator to work towards. Does any of this make any sense? Does anybody? Somebody nod their head. So I feel like I'm not a Martian. Because I understand this perfectly. And honestly, I like hearing it, but I don't know if anybody else does. So it's all about shared responsibility and shared authority. Now, and then, let's say they're equals. There's a first among equals. Who's the first among equals? Who's the most responsible and authority? You? Okay, all right. Well, what's your name? Who is it?
I want to rule the world.
The operator.
The utility.
That's right. The operator is responsible for safety. Everyone else is just confirming safety and preparing. But the operator is responsible for safety. And the operator must do more than just meet the requirements of the regulator. The operator has to exceed the requirements of the regulator and seek excellence. Right? And in Japan, you're doing that. We have members of JANSI here tonight, and their role is Dr. Kugo Nagawa. Their role is to achieve excellence in operations with the utility. So you look at the utility and say, we're going to establish the laws and the requirements. We want you to seek excellence and be responsible for the fleet. So you have to have this balance, right? You have to have a balance for it to be healthy. Yes, sir.
And then hopefully a stronger
regulatory body that
Without saying.
well,
Right.
the operator should be, the utility should be seeking excellence. Well, they should be seeking excellence. The utility, the regulatory body also has to know when to fire a warning shot.
Absolutely.
You know, when
Absolutely.
standards are,
Right.
are getting lax.
The idea of the regulator, which I spent 27 years as a regulator, is, okay, Congress gave us the laws, the elected official gave us the laws, they told us to regulate to that standard, we go assure compliance to it. And compliance to those laws means safety. Now, we want the operator to do more than just, so that the regulator, that'll be like question 1 on this exam, you know? It's easy to get by. Even I think I could do 2x minus 5y equals 10. Okay, I think I can solve that equation. So it should be easy for them to answer the regulator's requirements, because we expect much more out of them than that. And working together and seeking excellence. So one of the other organizational issues you had in Japan was this competition set up with these 9 utilities that didn't like to share with each other. Right? They didn't share. They didn't. And the role of JANSI is to try to encourage best practices, standardization. Right? So that's what you're trying to do. In the United States, after 3 Mile Island, I'm not telling you anything that's secret. You know, Metropolitan Edison failed at 3 Mile Island. That utility failed at 3 Mile Island. Said some ridiculous things. Like, why do we need to tell you everything about what's going on in the reactor? Remember that statement? And that was the point where they lost complete credibility, and everyone knew they were failing. Another utility came in, brought in engineers, and basically took over that accident from another utility that took over the management of that accident. So you have to have that collaboration of the industry, that they can work together and help solve each other's problems. Right? So that's another important element for the. So in summary, Kyle, which you really ought to read the rest of this stuff, because it's pretty good. I think the author just did a wonderful job. But I think I made my points. Let me summarize them. Well, in conclusion, I think the policy crisis is really a crisis. If Japan wants to get to the question of restart, then you have to have some urgency about the policy crisis and work on that. And if the elected officials are troubled by that, they don't want to, they're worried about the talking to the people, imagine that, then you have to establish some other entity. A Blue Ribbon Commission. The Kemeny Commission at 3 Mile Island was a commission that was used, the Kemeny Commission was used to understand all these issues, because they were beyond, honestly, are there any elected officials in here? Raise your hand if you're elected official. Okay, good. So it was beyond the capacity of the elected officials to understand some of these issues. They're very technical. So the Kemeny Commission was the interpreter, right? They understood the issues. They talked to the public, and then they proposed something to the government. So I would recommend something like the Kemeny Commission. If the elected officials are concerned about the politics of this thing, right? If they're concerned about the public opinion. My point is, I'm not talking about restart. I'm talking about what it takes to get to that question. All right? What you have to do to get there. We're not even at that question yet. I don't think they're ready for that. I think you've got to answer these other questions before you're ready to answer that question. I'm not, somebody asked me today, are you anti-nuclear, are you, pro-nuclear or whatever? Here's what I am. I'm pro-safety. Okay? I'm pro-safety. What I care about is safety. If you're going to operate a reactor, call me. Okay? I'm going to help you with safety. If you're not going to operate a reactor, have a nice day. See you at the park. Okay? Whatever. But we'll have a beer together. But if you're operating one, I ain't having a beer with you. So you have to have this sense of urgency. The other thing you have to do is, this was an institutional, organizational, or systems breakdown right? So it needs an organizational or system, whatever you want to call it, whatever label you want to put on it, institutional, organizational, systems breakdown, then it needs an organization, systems solution, right? It's not just, well, let's get a new regulator and the regulator will take care of it for us, right? And then what happens in that case, if you put all that power in the regulator, then what the regulators have to worry about is that everyone's pushing them to be independent, right? And that's happening today. They get all these international advice about your regulator has to be independent. Independence is good. I mean, that's motherhood. That's great. But it shouldn't be isolationist, right? Not an isolationist regulator that doesn't listen to the public, doesn't listen. So one of our value statements in the United States in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is, you know, be independent, but don't be isolated. So you need to take these societal issues on as a regulator, beyond just the technical. We love the technical. We got hundreds and thousands of engineers that just love that technical side. But you've got to take care of the societal crisis. Crisis leadership. You know, every country can benefit. I've talked a little bit about the data flow. Every country can benefit by stronger crisis leadership. There's more I could say about that, but that's what I'll leave you with, is that crisis leadership is the key. Finding an interpreter that can help you with the information, the speed of the information, all those things that I talked about, I think are essential. And what I said this afternoon was, I hope that Fukushima Daiichi, I hope in the future that in Japan there are more pages in the science books about Fukushima Daiichi than there are in the history books. Okay? So what we have to do is teach people about the technology and what health effects are and all that. So let's just hope that in Japan we have more pages in science books than we do in textbooks. I got to do that. Thank you.
Everyone, we have to get out of here exactly at 9, but we have time for 45 minutes for a nice Q&A. So
There's going to be questions?
Yeah, and maybe some tough ones. So we'll keep them, try to keep your questions short, and if you could please wait for the mic.
Yeah, that way I get to have longer answers.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Dr. Tim Williams, and what I would like to know is, do you think the Japanese government listened to you when you got here? And the reason I ask that is because there was a nuclear NBC team here from Maryland right after that. They were here a month, they were never used, so they went back to the U.S.
That, again, I didn't think we were going to ask hard questions. Okay? So that. You know, I get asked that question all the time. There's a couple of problems. There were a couple of problems. One, we didn't give the Japanese a chance, really. I mean, you have this was, and again, I told you, I'm going to take a lot more longer on your answer than you did on the question. But look, mankind has never faced the forces of nature and physics that the Japanese had to face that day. The deaths from the tsunami, the earthquake, the nuclear event. Outside of war, you know, what government has had to face those issues? Look, we had the Great San Francisco earthquake, Hurricane Katrina, and 3 Mile Island. We didn't do so well on any of those. Okay, so that's an earthquake, a tsunami, a hurricane, and a nuclear accident. We didn't do so well on any of them. The Japanese had all of those in one day, and more than 3 Mile Islands. Okay? So, and immediately it's web streamed. So they're trying to assimilate the information, which there wasn't any, right? Even the information, much of the information was unknowable, right? It was the equipment was gone. It was unknowable. So immediately, because of the web stream and the explosion, understandably, the press, the public are saying, what's going on, right? Well, meanwhile, as I said before, governments are slow. They try to be deliberative. They try to give out responsible information, but yet they had very little opportunity to do that. to have that. I mean, I was over here just a couple of days. We had 2 early arrivers. We had naval reactors here. You know, there was the American embassy calling Prime Minister the instant, you know, that happened. You know, all those stories. So, you know, did they have time to assimilate and get the information out? I agree, as I said earlier, we ought to have timelines for governments to get the information out. I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but it's an answer to some question. Okay? I'm not sure which one, but it's an answer, and I just think it needs to be said. That, you know, so, because I get this question all the time. The other thing is we made mistakes. The people coming in made mistakes. You know, we were not used to first world response to a first world nation. We do really good at humanitarian response to a third world nation. But this was kind of the first world of the first world. So not only is the magnitude of the event beyond what mankind has ever faced outside of war, right? Then you have this issue, right? So we, for instance, my team, just talk about my team, what I know. I don't know about this other team, but I can tell you what I know. We came in and we were engineers. My team was a bunch of engineers. So we said, go find some engineers and find out what's going on, right? So we run to TEPCO and we run to NISA and we said, tell us what's going on, Mr. Engineer. Well, how much information do you think one engineer knows about this accident? Right? They know from their perspective and whatever they've heard through the grapevine, because there was no data to begin with. So the first few days, we're working with individual engineers who are postulating, you know, and we think they're talking for the utility, you know, and they're saying things that they're personal opinions, not informed opinions, or not representative of the utility, right? So then that leads to a lot of confusion about, well, they don't want to tell us things, they tell us misinformation, they do all. So one of the things I learned in crisis leadership was you really got to get up to a level in the leadership, you know, that has that big picture, that has that global picture. We started out thinking that engineer to engineer was the best mechanism, but this event was too big for any one person. When you look at Yoshida, look, how would you like to have been that guy, huh? So let me tell you, any criticism of Yoshida is, in my mind, is not valid. Put yourself in that person's shoes with what he had, the situation he had. He's a hero in my mind. I've been an operator for many, many years of that type of reactor, and I can't imagine, as an operator and an instructor, I used to instruct on those reactors, to be in that situation that he was in, with fearful of people, your workers' lives. You know, the military's used to that kind of thing. The military expects death in their missions. They train for it. They cohabitate. They do a lot of things to train for that. Is that a short enough answer? But you can wind me up. I'm telling you, I'll get going. But the military trains for that. But we don't train civilian workers for that stuff. For people coming in injured. You know, he had workers coming in injured. People afraid, buildings exploding. I mean, this was real. This isn't esoteric, isn't theoretical. This is happening. People are getting hurt. There's, you know, devastation everywhere. To think of that situation Yoshida was in, and Masuda at Daini. He too. Look at the August edition of the Harvard Business Review. I recommend. There's a really wonderful article in there about Daini, and soon in the November edition of the Harvard Business Review, it'll be reprinted by a tremendous author. The story of Daini. And so buy the Harvard Business Review. I don't make a penny off of it, but if you look at that story in the Harvard Business Review in November when it comes out in Japan, just look at the story of Daini and what Masuda did. You know, truly heroic. Him and his team Masuda, I call him. I was up there yesterday with them. Look, I was an operator. I can empathize with what those people did. So let's go to the next question. Sorry, Doctor. I'm sorry, he's got a microphone, you don't, so he wins. That's a great book, too. Yeah. Steve Jobs' book. Right. Wonderful.
So what do you envision, in your opinion, is necessary as far as regulatory reform? And do you foresee any local governments, prefectures, cities having a say in future regulation?
That's good. That's a really good question. Your name is?
Saloni?
Cameron?
Yeah, Cam.
Cam?
Yep.
Hey Cam, that's a really good question. That's the national dialogue that has to happen. Okay, is what role do the prefectures play? If you think nuclear power is in the strategic interest of the nation, right? If that's a national strategic interest, then it has to be a natural asset. With input from the locals, no doubt about that. Input from the locals. In the United States, we consider it a national asset. Right? So the locals have some responsibility and authority, particularly in emergency planning. Right? We look at them for emergency planning. But as far as the nation has made a decision from the national level in the laws that there will be nuclear power. So that's a dialogue, Cam, that you have to have. Yes, sir.
Yes.
This mic is really hot, so keep it some distance.
I see. Okay. So I used to be the Japanese equivalent to the State Department spokesman sometimes. So I'm going to ask you about crisis communication.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the fact that all sorts of speculations, misguided information, and so forth filled the space.
Right.
The question is, how does a government spokesman or typical spokesman jump into that space? And my question is related, for example, to the fact that at least the way the information was given out, it seemed to give the impression that the authorities were hiding something about the level of the accident, 5 or 7,
right.
About the meltdowns, whether or not there were meltdowns, and also the delay in the release of the speedy data. What would be your advice in handling this sort of situation in terms of communication?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that question, and I'm glad you asked it because it allows me to go off on another soapbox that I have, and almost anything you ask will. So crisis communications, and whether it's the people or the politicians you're talking to, here's what I learned. I'll share it. I won't charge you anything for this, I promise. Okay, but if you want to donate, that's okay. To my child's college fund. So here's what I learned about this issue about, I'll tell you the secret, about murder without knowing what and how to talk to the people and how to talk to politicians. And this is going to sound a little sketchy to you, but trust me, it'll work. You have to, when you don't know, when you have all this random data out there, you have all this information, you don't know the reliability of the source, you don't know, you really have to set goalposts with the politicians and with the people. Say, they're all worst cases, right? I mean, a nuclear accident never can be a best case. But you take your best worst case. You know, what do we think is the best case situation here? And then you look at a reasonable worst case. So those are your goalposts. And you set that goalpost. You got it? Write this down. I think this will be a quiz question because it's really important. Thanks for asking the question. So, unless the data comes in outside of the goalpost and is confirmed that it's outside the goalpost, right? You do what I call you let the data bake. Okay? You let it sit wherever it is, inside or outside the goalpost, until you can get more data to confirm if it's inside or outside. Does that make any sense at all? In my little mind, it makes perfect sense, right? So here's what happened. Ambassador Ruse, early on in the accident, was just like Kahn, was getting information from everywhere. Spoke to people talking, right, saying they're getting information from everywhere. Much of it is not accurate. So when you're sharing that as a spokesperson, you're sharing what you know, you're trying to be open and honest and sharing all that. But what it does is it just whipsaws, if you know what that phrase means. It just pulls the politicians and the people everywhere. Right? So you set these goalposts, and unless you confirm that the situation is outside the goalposts, you just let it bake. Let the information bake. And if somebody asks you the question, what about this piece of information? You say, look, we understand it, we see it, and we're gathering more information on that to see what it means. right? We're not certain of that information, so we're trying to see what it means. And if we get confirmation of it, and if it's outside the goalpost, we'll let you know. Meanwhile, have a nice day between the goalposts, right? And that's what I learned with Ambassador Ruse. Because early on, before I got here, the first few days before I got here, I recognized that people were running up to him with random data points. They go, "What, Ambassador, this is a data point. What it means, or what it could mean, is Armageddon," right? 20 minutes later, they come up with another data point and say, "Well, this data point means it's not as bad," right? So what's the leader supposed to do with all that? Your job as the crisis leader, so to speak, the middle below the elected official level, is to be that interpreter, is to set those goalposts and manage up so that those people can understand. Does any of that make any sense? Does that go through? Okay, I'm not going to charge you for it, I promise. And I could say more, but I'm actually going to let you guys ask some more questions. Yes, sir.
Chuck, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Andre Boyer, and I have a quick question. You're talking about national safety, and on an international level, how do we start that conversation internationally? And you're talking about an acceptable level of risk. On the international level, what would be your advice to to the leadership?
Yeah, and I think you see it. The IEA is the one who generally sets the international standards. So the challenge with the IEA is that you're not compelled to follow it, right? So then you have to look at the G7, the G8, whatever, I don't know. We kick people in and out of that G thing, whatever it is. I'm not sure what that thing is, but you can tell me, okay? So G7 or G8, whatever that means, the group of 7, the group of 8. So that authority has some authority. We've got treaties and all those things that could be. So in my mind, is there any IEA people in here? Okay, I could say, and if there's any press in here, put this on background. So really, I think some of that authority and responsibility, we talked about the balance of power, should be over to G7, G8, OECD, those who have authority with treaties and all those things, rather than, now there's conventions for the IEA. You sign on to a convention. And there's a few IEA conventions in nuclear that Japan has not ratified yet. So I think that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the only thing I can think of. And I gotta say something. I gotta have some answer. I don't look smart. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much for your wonderful perspective, and welcome back to Japan.
You haven't talked to my wife. She doesn't think anything I do is too wonderful.
Okay. My name is Tanaka. My question is, from your expert point of view, could you tell us the gap you expected to see between today or this week after your visit to Daiichi Daini and what you expected 3 years ago in handling the aftermath of the crisis at the Genba?
Yeah, the last time I was up at Fukushima was last September. And I can tell you that my trip yesterday to Daiichi and Daini, I was amazed at the level of activity at Daiichi. It's unbelievable. So to anybody who thinks that utility is not putting resources to this, it's massive. The amount of effort is probably tenfold from just a year ago that I saw. It's absolutely amazing that those hardworking people, there's people working in very difficult circumstances at that place, at that site, working very hard and very challenging. You know what I mean by challenging circumstances, and that takes a lot of dedication and effort. And to see them, everything is difficult. Every time they face a challenge and have a repair, it causes unintended consequences, and then they have to fix that. They had tanks that were leaking, so they put berms around the tanks, to keep them from reaching the ocean. Well, the rain comes down, and I'm just giving you an example. The rain fills up the berm, right? So then if there's a leak, it overflows. So now we got to stop the rain from coming, right? We got to stop Mother Nature. So now you have to put up shields over the trenches so that the rain doesn't fill up the trench. So and that's how difficult it is that every fix creates an unintended consequence that then you have to go fix. And it just seems never ending, you know, that you have these challenges. So it's, for me, I mean, like I said, the amount of effort that those people are doing is really amazing. But I don't, it's funny because I told them yesterday that I don't really see it as a decommissioning. I see it as recommissioning. And I think they should look at the future because, you know, what they're doing is they're repairing something that someday will be a lot different. Right? So if I'm working up there, what I was thinking about yesterday, I was watching all these people work unbelievably hard in unbelievably terrible circumstances. And what struck me was, and this is just a personal, and this I'm not joking about, the dedication of those people, and what they're really working for is, for the first time, a child kicks a ball on a field where that plant used to be. Okay? That's what they're working for. All right? And you know, I hope they understand that. I tried to tell them that yesterday, but not in so articulate way. I tried to tell them that's what they're working for, right? You're not decommissioning. You are doing that technically, but what you're really working towards is someday there'll be a park there. There'll be kids flying kites, families having lunch, kids kicking a soccer ball or football, whatever it is you do in here. But so that's what they're working for. And they won't get to, it'll take 40, they won't likely get to enjoy it, but other generations will. So they're working for the future. They're working for generations. And what more noble thing than to work like that, know that you're not going to take benefit from it, but somebody else will. You know, so I have great tribute to them and what they're doing up there today. I'm sorry, I get a little soft there, but who are we going to? Thank goodness I don't have the mic.
So, Lucas Sheep, software engineer at Bosch. I was wondering about these mechanisms that made this accident possible in the first place, and you mentioned that there should be a balance between the regulators and the utilities. And actually, there is something here which is commonly communicated as the nuclear village. And I'm wondering whether there has been any, let's say, realistic improvements to encounter this close connection between regulators and utilities to avoid future accidents.
Good question. And I think my answer to that is the pendulum has swung, you know, completely on the regulators' side. And if you do that, the problem with doing that is that the owner won't take ownership. If you say that safety belongs to the regulator and they're the guardians of safety, then why does the regulator have, the utility have incentive? So that it's a collaboration. Remember I talked about this is all about a balance of responsibility, a balance of authority. The utility should be the leader. And I know what you're going to say is, well, the utility was a leader before Fukushima, right? And we had this problem. So, but there's got to be the right checks and balances. Somebody mentioned it before, the regulator wasn't strong enough. So you've got to make sure that your organization is strong enough, resilient enough that it can deal with these situations when they come up. Somebody talked about the warning, you know, when they're not in compliance. So you have a regulator with teeth that can say you're not in compliance. So, and I could get into much more in that area, but I think I'll leave it at that, whatever that level of answer is. Yes, sir.
So, Doctor, quick question for you. My name is Robert Ross.
Hey, Robert, Chuck. And by the way, what I was going to say about the Bosch, I used to use your spark plugs, but I don't do that anymore. Yeah, well, I don't pay for them anymore.
And I'm an attorney and former nuclear engineer.
You're a what?
Attorney and former nuclear engineer. So, in terms of, you talked about the importance of having industry being a good partner to the regulator and to the politicians in terms of ensuring nuclear safety. But one element that I haven't really heard many people address is how you deal with the corporate culture, throughout Japanese corporate entity or organizations. In general, compared to the United States, there's not as much, like a flow of individuals in and out. And then, as it relates to the nuclear industry here in Japan, in particular, you don't have that fear of, that we have in the United States of the nuclear navy and some of the, like very demanding requirements related to that. So how do you overcome those inherent problems or relative to the United States model here in Japan?
What's your first name again?
Robert.
Robert. Have you been to any of my other lectures?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's one of those questions sounded like exactly something I was going to talk about. I forgot the question, but I think what the question was, what about the corporate structure? Corporate structure is CEO, and that is an area where the Japanese have to work on, and the Americans have to work on about that corporate structure. Jancy, I know, is working on informing the CEOs of what business they're in. You're in the nuclear business, and nuclear is special. If the CEO of the company doesn't know that, there's a big problem. And if they don't have knowledge of nuclear on their board of directors, that's a big problem. And Robert, there was another part of your question that I wanted to get to, but I forgot what it was.
Acknowledging that you have to have that kind of knowledge, how do you get there? At least in the United States, you have people between companies, and then you also have the feeder of of a government organization, in fact, that supplies. Actually, Robert, I'm going to exempt you from the exam tonight because that point, you've taken enough. And that point is an extremely important point for Japan. Because what happened in the United States is, and I hated this when I was an operator. When I was an operator, I'm an old country boy. I grew up a C student. I'm not really smart, okay? But I grew up the hard way, worked my way up the chain. And then these Navy guys would come in. Navy officers would come in and knew all about submarines, and they would tell us the way it is. And I hated those guys. Like, hey, I grew up twisting valves and running pumps and stuff, and you come in here and you're going to tell us the way it is. But after I got older, I realized in the nuclear industry, really, they set the standard. Rickover. We all know Rickover, right? And they brought Rickover standards into the American nuclear industry. And that was tremendous. That came from Rickover, and the Navy people made a big. So here's what I worry about for Japan. Where's their source of independent nuclear knowledge? And that has to be addressed. That's one of those other issues that needs to be addressed, because your sources in Japan of independent technical knowledge are either academia, students coming out of academia, or people from the industry, which there's nothing wrong with people in the industry, don't get me wrong. But in your regulator, you need a balance. The Americans are lucky because they have the nuclear navy for that independent source of technical knowledge. And trust me, I worry about the Americans. I worry greatly about the Americans because that source is dried up. Okay? We get very few people from the nuclear navy anymore, and I see in the American regulator, which I was part of for 27 years, more and more industry people coming in, and then very young people. In the United States, you're not allowed to call them young. You have to call them inexperienced. Early career people. I'm an old man, I'm retired, and I call them young. Okay? So they're bringing all these young engineers in, right, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. You got to have a tree farm. It's got little trees, it's got middle-sized trees, and it's got big trees, right? You harvest the big ones, and then the little ones come along. So you got to have a tree farm. But I worry about the Japanese without that independent source of technical knowledge. And I think the way to work on that, and I talked to a professor today from Tokyo Tech, Saito? Is that how we pronounce it? Saito? And he has a program where he's taking young people, putting them through a PhD program and making them global leaders who get experience around the world in crisis leadership. And I think those kind of, fertilizing that and growing that out of academia and other places and giving people broad experience by sending them overseas to see other activities, that's probably the best option for Japan in growing that independence. You need people from, there's not a problem bringing people from the utility into the regulator. There's not a problem with that. We do it all the time. I came from the utilities and went into the regulator, and I think I was pretty good. All right? Again, don't ask my wife, but talk to me. I think I was pretty good, and I came from the utilities. I was balanced, pro safety, all that stuff. So I think you could do that, but you don't want, you don't want 90% of your people coming from the industry. So you got to have that balance. I'm glad you said that, Robert, because that, seriously, I'm being serious. That's a very good point. It's a crucial decision for the Japanese. And here's the problem we're having in the United States. You don't always get the best and the brightest in dirty industries. And I'm not calling nuclear dirty, but get what I mean. Stay with me here. A lot of these eco jobs, right? These kids coming out of school in the environmental area, they want, blue skies and puppy dogs, clean, green energy sources. They all want to work in solar, and they want to work in, but nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong. But we need them. I was on an airplane the other day with a young lady that came out of a really good school in New England on environmental engineering. And I said, young lady, what are you thinking about doing? She told me, she's looking for some job, at some green job somewhere. And I said, well, fracking in the United States is really taking off. How about in the fracking industry? And you would swear that I don't know, I poked her or something, right? I mean, she was like so offended because I suggested she would go work for fracking. She was like, well, no, that's nasty. Or maybe she said it that way, like, that's nasty. And I think she said it that way. So, like, that's nasty. And I said, well, how about this? Why not go into an industry that you consider to be dirty, fracking, and help clean it up? Anybody can go into a solar plant and say, man, I'm green, right? That's not a challenge. Go into fracking or go into nuclear. So I talked to people on Deepwater Horizon, part of my research. And the problem with the oil industry and deep water drilling was the technology was moving faster than the people's knowledge. And that's one of the big elements that led to the Deepwater Horizon explosion, was the fact that people were just too inexperienced to be running those wells that were doing that deep drilling. They had no idea what they were doing, right, in reality. I don't know if I should say that, but I'm retired. So, I mean, they didn't really have a good grasp of what was going on. So, and one of the reasons was because the best and the brightest out of the universities won't go into that, will not go into that business, oil well drilling. So we have to worry about, are we attracting the best and the brightest into our industries? Are they all migrating to these high-tech industries or green industries or whatever it is? So that's a long answer. But it was a very good question, Robert. Yes, sir.
Name is Mark Resty. I have a question around, and I appreciate your broader view of what needs to be done in the nuclear industry as countries develop this. But I'm going to bring you down a little bit more granular into the OD, or organizational development. All of us in this room know of Japanese work practices very different than that in the States. We're very individualistic in the States, very collectivist here. And could you give us some comments on some of the shocks that you got? And some of them are going to be positive to take home to the States, and some are going to be, whoops, we need to do that better over here in terms of accountability, leadership, how the decision-making operates, and process and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Mark. And I don't know if I really have a good answer for you, but one of the things, a strategic advantage that we have in the United States is our diversity. That's a real strategic advantage in the United States. By having people from different nationalities, different backgrounds, different work ethics, it becomes a real strength. People are willing to challenge each other, openly challenge each other. And I think one of the things I saw with the Japanese culture, there's less willingness to to speak up in the middle of a formal meeting. Most things, I mean, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, right? Most things are done behind the scenes, and then the formal meeting is, you know, sort of a pro forma exercise in blessing the decision. So that, I think, you know, encouraging people to speak out and to speak truth to power is, you know, a cultural issue. But on the other hand, like you said, Mark, there were a lot of really good insights, and I learned a lot about the culture, and I had to learn really quickly. I mean, as I said, I'd never been to Japan before, and I picked up on the culture rather quickly. I think that's the reason that instead of being here for just 3 days, or whatever, a week, I ended up here a year, because I was able to pick up on the cultural differences between us and you know, the two sides or whatever. I used to hate calling it the two sides. They always call it the two sides, and we're all on the same side. It's not two sides, right? We're all on the same side. We're all for safety. So that, you know, I think there were a lot of advantages of sort of a homogeneous society. There's a lot of advantages of the diversity. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Mark, but I could go into a lot of granularity about but you adapt, you know. I remember there was a lot of formality when we go into meetings about the chair arrangement, about who sits where, all that stuff, right? And rather than this is just a little, you know, anecdote, rather than fight that stuff and say, you know, if you've been picked up on it, I'm a pretty frank person and just like to cut to the chase, right? So I'm like, that stuff just drives me nuts, worrying about the chair arrangement and all that, you know, who's sitting where and this and that. And so finally I just told my guys, my people, I said, look, before we go into this meeting, arrange the chairs, okay, yourself, right? We can do that. We know the way they want the chairs. Let's just arrange the chairs ourselves and get that over with so that we can sit down and start meeting. So there are cultural things that you adapt to. You know, you don't fight it, you just accept it and use it and move on. One of the things, the interpreters, Mariko Nagai she's a wonderful woman. You know her. She is an amazing woman. That lady is incredible. Mariko Nagai. She's the mayor of Tokyo's interpreter, and she was the official interpreter for the Olympic bid, 2020 Olympic bid. And I encourage you, if you ever get a chance to hear her speak on, the title of her session is Utterances of Famous Japanese Women. She gives lecture series around Japan on that. And she's an amazing woman. And Lauren, I got off track, but you know, one of the things I would do is sit with Mariko probably longer than the meeting took. And what I would say to her is, look, I don't want you to translate, I want you to interpret. Here's what I'm trying to achieve. Here's what I'm trying to achieve in this meeting. Help me achieve it in Japanese. Okay? I don't care if you translate my words, whatever it is, help me, you know, so you learn those techniques, you learn those cultural things, and you learn you have to spend as much time with your interpreter, or more time, than the meeting itself. So, you know, I took back a lot of really valuable insights, and look, I'm blessed. I am actually, absolutely, I am the luckiest person on earth. There is no doubt about it. You know, I really am. I'm completely blessed because of the people I've met over here, the friendships, the experience. So, is there any other questions, or we run out? Yes, sir.
Talking about the Olympic bid for 2020, at the final presentation session, Prime Minister Abe categorically mentioned Fukushima nuclear plant is under control. What was your reaction when you heard it?
Well, it is under control. It is. When it went to cold shutdown December 20th or something like that, in terms of reactor, you know, when cold shutdown is cold shut, that's as you know, about as safe as you can get. Now, the question of releases, the issue, and I can tell you my exposure up there yesterday from being right up against the building, it's a very isolated, very specific location problem. It's not. The dose rates were very low, extremely low, and I was really encouraged to see the traffic jam. I mean, nothing sweeter than a bunch of brake lights when you've had a nuclear disaster. Okay, there was nothing better than a bunch of brake lights. We got trapped in Highway 6 now is open through that area, and for me, just in a year, to see that Highway 6 is open with traffic jams, man, I was excited because that means life is returning, right? And people are coming in back into the area, except for the immediate, maybe 8 kilometers, something like that, around the plant. But 10 kilometers to 20 kilometers or something like that, life is slowly returning. But I given what I saw the first time I went up there, which changed my life. I've been in the nuclear business for many years, and the first time I went to Daiichi just right after the accident, it was so powerful because what I recognized was we cannot ever let this happen again anywhere in the world. Okay, it cannot happen again, and we can't operate plants if it's going to happen. The other thing is that Yoshida and Masuda and their teams were heroes. No doubt in my mind, they are heroes. In the nuclear industry over the decades, we've had a lot of heroes. Browns Ferry, where I worked at, caught on fire, and there were people who put that fire out after 8 hours and near miss on melting that reactor down. Unit 1 at Browns Ferry. They were heroes. There's been heroes throughout the nuclear, the people at Chernobyl shoveling the core. There's been what we have to assure in nuclear power in the world is that we value and we honor those heroes that we had, but we don't want any more. Okay? No more heroes. We don't want to put the people in a situation where they have to take heroic action. All right? If they're taking heroic action, we have failed them. So in terms of Masuda and Yoshida, they were put in situations that no person should ever be put in again. If we can't operate them safely, then they can't operate. And if we don't have good emergency planning, then we shouldn't be operating them. Yes, ma'am.
Chuck.
Over here. James.
Hi.
I know his name. That's
Thanks. I just had 2 quick questions. One, you were talking about you can't have this happen again. And one thing, I'm researching a book. My name is James Sims. I'm a journalist, and I'm researching a book on Fukushima. And in talking to industry experts in the United States, one of their concerns is that something is going to happen like this in one of the developing countries, which are introducing nuclear power. And those countries, they're going to have much lower levels of transparency, checks and balances. Yep. And it doesn't seem like this is being addressed. I know the IAEA was trying to do something, but sovereignty issues trump that. And so, I mean, where do we go from here? Because Japan, US, France, Russia, they're trying to export to developing countries. Right. And I don't think there's a structure in place, as you mentioned, in terms of the protocols, in terms of the data disclosure. It seems to me that's a huge problem.
Thanks, James. And are there any Jordanians in here? Okay, so there are some countries that I don't believe have this structure to be able to operate nuclear plants, who want to. I might have just mentioned one. And actually, Dr. Saito, is that what I said his name was? Saito from Tokyo Tech was talking about this today. He thinks that he proposes that there be sort of an international response team that can go in and look at this. But the reason I opened up with what I did open up with about the data flow, about treaties with countries that have nuclear power, about what information they'll provide and what timelines they'll provide, and common terminology, that's why we need that. All right, so we can make decisions. One of the issues we had in the United States about the Japan event was with the struggle we had within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I don't know if I'm telling this out of school or not, but was hey, look, not our reactor, not our country. There were people who had that position, right? Not our reactor, not our country. But we had American citizens in harm's way, and we felt, and needed to support it, and the president made the decision to support it. So, but you had a camp that said, you know, not our problem, but obviously the president thought better of that, and we wanted to protect 200,000 American citizens in Japan. So, but if they give you the information, then you can make decisions. If they don't give you the information, then you're going to struggle. Does that make any sense, James?
Well, I mean, I talked to one of the heads of one of the nuclear operators in the U.S., and he said he likened nuclear plant to marriage. It's easy to get married, but you've got to deal with each other for 20, 30, 40 years. And that's the issue, I think, at hand for nuclear power plants. You have the maintenance, and if something goes wrong, you know, Japan couldn't deal with it. The U.S. had problems, and so there are countries that are out there, which I'm like, you know, I question whether, you know, I would even want to, I don't know, fly on their airline.
Well, I think that's one of the advantages of the IEA. You know, a little bit earlier I kind of challenged the IEA, but I think that's the advantage because they can go in with a light touch to these countries that are members of the IEA nuclear side. And, you know, we're to have 1, 2, or 3 agreements with the United States. You know, if you to get a 1, 2, or 3 agreement with the United States on cooperation, you've got to meet certain requirements. To be a member of the IEA, you have to meet certain requirements. So if an emerging nation doesn't become a member of the nuclear community in the IEA, that's a huge problem, and it should be called out. Otherwise, at least you have the IEA who can go in and will go in and make assessments of those emerging countries. I do one right now, to be honest with you, but with to be what's the word I'm looking for? To be open. You know, I work with the United Arab Emirates, their regulator, and they're building 4 nuclear plants over there. You know, so and the IEA has been there. You know, the IEA. And people, you know, think about them too. You know, what kind of society do they have, and are they open to transparent? But even in a country like that, you know, they're receptive, and they know that they have to be part of the IEA, and there have been IEA missions over there to confirm that they meet the international standards. Mark's got another question.
I might be able to speak to that issue that Mr. Sims brought up.
Good, because I don't know I did that.
It's not just a political international response, but then it's also a commercial response as well. For example, a lot of these entities that are trying to create a domestic nuclear power industry, they depend on financing, international financing. And one of the conditions very often with respect to that financing is that you exceed a certain provisions, certain agreements, or that you establish a regulatory structure that's consistent with one that, you know, is from a responsible nuclear actor like the United States. You mentioned the UAE is a great example of that. There are in fact law firms that are hired by these entities, by these countries, to go and help them develop a regulatory system that is consistent with international norms.
And I just worked with one of those law firms as much as, you know.
And Hillsbury?
Let me think of their name in a minute. When we're done, I'll think of their name. But I was with one of the law firms in UAE just a couple of weeks ago. So the other thing is the European Union, NEA, the NEA and the European Union. To be a nuclear state in the European Union, I worked with the Hungarians when they started their application for the EU. And you have to assure the EU, if you have nuclear plants, there are certain financial safety requirements that you have to put in your application to the European Union before you can become a member of the EU. So there are other, I think, Mark, you're right, there's other avenues besides just the regulators that are at play. We have a hard stop, I think.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.